I'm going to assume that you just watched my other session on getting started with CDK and how we just ran through the web page and just ran a few CDK commands. So we ran CDK ls, CDK synth, and I just mentioned CDK deploy and CDK destroy. So those are the main commands that I generally run. And so today I'm just going to show you what a worked solution might look like. So in the previous example, I didn't actually have any resources and code actually built out just yet. So this session, I just want to go through some of the things and what it might actually look like when you've got a solution up and running. Okay. So I'm going to assume that you understand what CDK is, AWS CLI is, and here, as we saw before, I'm just running CDK ls, and as I mentioned, the entry point goes into app.py as the entry point, okay? Now, if you go through this, let me just make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so in this solution, we've got a few more things. So remember in the other one, we had an empty test app stack. Now in this one is more closer aligned to what we're going to need in our production and for a lot of our solutions going forward. All right, so here I've just created a repository stack. So somewhere where I'm going to store all my application code, a pipeline stack, somewhere that's going to store all the resources that's going to look after the process of taking my application code from my repository stack and then deploying it into an application. Okay. Then what else do I have here? I actually have another pipeline stack here. Okay, so the reason why I duplicated the pipeline stack is just to demonstrate how we can have multiple pipelines existing in parallel to look after different branches. So if you've already been working with me on existing decision services solutions, you would have already been familiar with the way that we've been branching out our solution. So even though you've got a master branch in our code repository for everything, we still do all of the development work in separate branches, and all of those separate branches hook into separate code pipelines, which manage the deployment for each of those branches separately. So this is just a different way of managing that. So here is just defining that I've got one pipeline that is going to be looking after the master branch. And then here I've got a second pipeline that's looking after the development branch. Okay. And so now when we go down to the bottom here, so I did a CDK ls, and I've just left a blurb here on how to actually push the current code that's on my local hard drive back up into a code commit repository. So as I mentioned here, I've got a repository stack. So if this was a totally new solution, I would be deploying this repository stack, and then I'll be running these commands to push my local copy of all the code into the deployed instance of this repository CDK evaluation stack. Okay. At the moment, I believe this one has already been deployed. Okay, so this one is here. So repository-CDK-valuation. So this actually is a CDK version of the asset valuation calculator. So if you open up this one, then you can see that it's pretty basic. It's only got a code commit repository in it. That's all. And I just wanted to keep that separate from everything else, since that's largely going to be unchanged for the most part. Okay, and then you can see down here, we've got pipeline-CDK-valuation-dev. So this actually corresponds to this one. And then we've got another one for the master branch, as I mentioned, this one here. But then you notice these other things down here. Now, none of these things are actually defined in the app.py. And what this is, these are other stacks that get deployed as a result of these pipelines. Okay, so let me just show you what it looks like to spin up one of these. Let me just delete. Let me just delete these things. Okay, so here I've got pipeline CDK valuation master, right? So that's this one. So I'm not going to touch this one today since it's already existing and it actually does have code in there right now. So CDK, I'm going to destroy it. So what this is going to do, it's actually going to go off to CloudFormation and initiate a delete. So it's gone off, found the appropriate CloudFormation stack and is just asking if I want to delete it. And then here, it should start delete in progress. Okay, so now it's deleting. And here you can see all of the events that are happening. So here it's starting to delete all the policies, the metadata, and all the bucket policy and everything, right? So here you can see its progress. It's basically the same as if you were to look at the events tab. It's one and the same. Okay, so what it's doing is just deleting the stack. That's all it's doing right now. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. How many resources have we got left? Still got a few. Okay, while we wait for that to delete. Okay, so this is the entry point, right? So this is the entry point, and you can see that it's importing pipeline stack and repository stack. Let's start simple. Let's start with the repository stack. Now, all of this is defined in the stacks directory under repository stack Python file. So here, stacks directory, repository stack. Okay. Now here, I'm importing the AWS CDK, importing the core component, and then importing code commit. So this is because I want to use a code commit repository, I actually need to import the library related to that service. In version 2, which is under preview at the moment, this is going to go away and it's just going to be a single import statement. But for the moment, for each different service that you want to use in your stack, you actually need to import a separate library. Okay. So I've imported the library, and then when I was showing you before, in the previous session, this was all kind of populated. Now we just call this class something arbitrary, something relevant. So this is the repository stack. And then it's just here that all we need to put in is saying that I want a new instance of code commit, specifically a repository. And I'm going to add that back as another element on this class, calling it repo. And this is just defining the scope. So saying that it's attached to this class. And this is an ID field. So I'm just calling it repository. Then I'm setting a repository name and then a description, and then just also making sure that the repository is retained if I happen to delete this stack in the future. This was just the bit of instructions that I left, just so in case you do want to create a new solution and you're creating a new repository and you just want an easy way to point to the repository that you've just created so you can upload the code there. So I just left this in there, but this is not important. Okay, so all of this whole class is a definition and it's an equivalent of a CloudFormation template. Now, is this one done? Yes. Okay, so now I can show you CDK synth. Name of the stack. Okay, so one thing to note is each time you do run CDK commands, it actually goes through your whole solution and synthesizes everything. So that's why you see a lot of these warning codes and everything. It's actually gone through my whole application. It's actually printing out all of the, I guess, warning messages attached to all of the stacks. Anyway, the relevant bit is here. So from here downwards, we can see it's a CloudFormation template, and here it's defined a code commit repository. It's got a repository name, it's got the description, it's got the deletion policy, which is to retain, and then the rest is just mainly metadata. So we're not going to do much with this one today, but I was just going to show the next one. So the pipeline stack. So this one is using a few more components using code pipeline pipelines. So pipelines is actually an abstraction on top of code pipeline. And then code pipeline actions, code commit, EC2, IAM, secrets manager, and web service stage. Okay, so this is something I'll get to a bit later. Okay, so here we are making a reference to the code repository stack that we just created. So this thing down here, which is this thing here, this repository. And then here we're using the pipelines. So pipelines, as I said, is a layer above code pipeline. So code pipeline is the service itself, the Amazon Web Service itself, but pipelines is kind of like a set of patterns that references code pipeline. So it's kind of like a shorthand. So here you just set up the source action. So here I'm telling it to hook into code commit. So each time a new commit is made to the repository, it's going to fire off the code pipeline process. Then here it's got a synth action. So this is basically the build process. What does it need to do to build the code into CloudFormation template? So you can see here, it's just running npm install, installing the CDK, installing Python libraries. Then it's running CDK synth. So CDK synth, when you don't actually specify any packages, will actually synthesize all of the stacks in your solution and then store them locally. And then this is just running a unit test. Okay. So this is equivalent of the code pipeline process that we have set up previously for our cross-account deployments. I'll show that a bit later. And then this last bit this last bit is web server stage. So this is saying that I want to deploy a copy of my web service. So this class is actually defined in this web server stage.py file. But these are some of the input parameters that I'm using. So this is the ID, this is the branch, this is the environment that I'm passing into this stack. These are some of the other environment variables. So I'm deploying this to the development account, to the Sydney region, and I'm also passing in the repository name. Okay, so once I've got that local application defined, then I'm saying I want to add this instance of the application into the pipeline above. Okay, so remember how for our cross-account deployment, we have our code in our development account, we have our code pipeline that does the build, test, deploy locally, then does integration test, then cross deploys into base, staging, and production. Now, what we have set up so far is this will do the first few steps. It will reference an existing code commit repository. It will activate when there's a commit to that code commit repository. It will start the build process for all the different environments. And then here I'm telling it to do a deployment locally. And then what else am I doing? Here I'm defining a integration test stage. So remember how we do code, trigger, then that triggers the build process, then we do unit test, then we do a deploy. So deploy was up above. Then we do an integration test. So this is the integrations test stage where it's running a shell script, it's running pip install, it's printing all the environment variables just for debugging purposes. Then it's running py tests, and then it's looking in the test directory under integration. And then it will run the test underscore appstack test, and it actually runs integration tests using all of these JSON files. Okay, and then it also, remember how we deployed the solution locally, but then we don't know the URL, we don't know the secrets. So all of those are getting passed in using this section. So we've got the private URL. So that is the API endpoint, which is VPC enabled. Then I've just passed in the public URL, which is the public facing internet API endpoint, and then here's the API key that gets passed in. Actually, this is the API key secret ARN. So this is slightly different. So instead of passing in the unencrypted key string into the code build process, we're actually passing the reference to the secret, and then the code build process will actually, or the test script will actually go in and retrieve the secret key from the secrets repository on AWS. So it's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more secure. And then we have our manual approval stage. Like normal, remember how we go through the different stages. We do our local deployment, we do our integration tests, then we have a approval stage to just manage the process before we deploy into base. Then we have another approval stage before we deploy into staging and subsequently production. Okay, then I've also added a second copy down here. So second local deployment. So here I've just called it something different. So development, descent, copy. So it's the same sort of thing, but I just wanted to test that I can deploy a second copy of my application alongside the previous copy and making sure that there's no conflicts with resources, no naming conflicts or anything. Okay, so that's all good and well. So what does that actually look like deployed? So remember how I destroyed or basically deleted the CloudFormation stack before? then I can deploy the stack via CDK. Right, so I want to deploy this one. So it's the pipeline CDK valuation master branch. So I'm going to run CDK deploy. Okay, and then it's going to throw a whole bunch of stuff at me. Okay, so what this is doing, it's actually telling you all the IAM statement changes and all the things that it needs to set up to make everything happen. So it's telling you what types of permissions it's going to allow. So for these specific roles here, so for CDK deployment role, it's going to need these permissions to this artifact. So it goes through all of that, and it's just saying, okay, are you happy with all of these policy changes? And yes. It's publishing, so it's going through the whole process of synthesizing. So remember, we have our pipeline stack defined as Python, and the synthesis process will translate this whole thing into a CloudFormation template. And then this deploy activity or command will deploy this into our linked AWS account. And here we can see the pipeline CDK valuation master. And here is the deployed template. And now it's going through the whole process of deploying everything again. And you can also see that on this page, if you like. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. Okay, now we'll go over to code pipeline. Let's wait for that one to get created. Okay, while we wait for this one to finish. Okay, so I mentioned before the web server stage. So it's an instance of an application, but it's not actually the definition of the application. So think of it as you've got your solution, which might include a Lambda function and an S3 bucket, right? And then that's included in this app stack. So this is actually the solution, which has Lambda, API Gateway, EC2, IAM, Secrets Manager, and all these other things, right? This is the actual solution. Then the web server stage is kind of like a wrapper on top of it. And here, all I'm doing is I'm identifying the synthesizer to use when I'm synthesizing a instance of my app stack. So if you saw on the bootstrapping session, I mentioned the importance of the qualifier ID. So I mentioned that there was 2 qualifier IDs. So in our account at the moment, we have this one that ends in S, and that actually has full permissions to everything. Then we have another instance of the CDK toolkit, which has been bootstrapped into our account, and that has been identified with the X at the end. And so that one has various permission boundaries already set up. And so this is kind of like just a wrapper around the app stack, and it's just defining the ID. And then this web service stage is referenced in the pipeline stack. So you can see it's referenced up here once for the local deployment, and then secondly down here for the copy of the local deployment. And so when it comes to deploying to base staging and production, then we would simply copy and paste this section, and we would change these IDs here. And we might also change this one to pod, for example. And so that's how that would work. So this is how the kind of cross-account deployment works. It's simply specifying the account, the region, and then what it does in the background, because I've specified the qualifier ID, it knows to go off to that external account, find that qualifier ID or the stack related to that, and then it will use the CDK toolkit resources to deploy my solution into that environment. Okay, I won't go into that in this session. So now it's completed the deployment. And when we come over here, it's complete. We've got all the resources deployed. They're all deployed. And now we should have another code pipeline. So pipeline CDK evaluation master. And so this one is much like the previous setup that we had before. When we were setting this all up manually through CloudFormation, we used to start off with a source, then we might have a build, and then we had a deployment. It was a 3-stage process for a very basic pipeline. Now this one's a little bit more. So we still have source that hooks into code commit, still will activate upon any commits into the repository for the given branch. Then you've got the build process. So this is synthesizing. So you still can click on details. And then here, okay, this one has unit tests included in this one. So here I'm running through all the unit tests for this solution. And then it's running the synthesizer. So that was this command, running CDK synth. Then it's synthesizing everything, storing all. Here you can see that it synthesized all of these things and it stored it locally. And so the synthesized versions of the templates get stored into S3 as kind of like package artifacts. And those package artifacts get picked up via the following steps. So if you recall back with our manual setup of code pipeline and CloudFormation and everything, remember how we had 2 separate stacks. We had a pipeline stack in CloudFormation, which had the code pipeline solution. And then we had an infrastructure stack also deployed in CloudFormation, right? And so the pipeline stack would manage the whole process of taking the code, building it, testing it, and then deploying the infrastructure stack. Now, each time that we made changes to our application code, right, we would just commit that change back to the repository, and then the code pipeline would just pick up that change and then deploy those changes all the way through to the infrastructure stack, right? Now, anytime that we wanted to change the pipeline itself, say for example, we wanted to enable or disable integration tests and unit tests, or we wanted to change the permissions of the deploying toolchain. That was a bit of a manual process, and we either could copy and paste that template back into the pipeline stack. Or what I did for the short term, I wrote up a simple shell script, which simply took the YAML version and then just uploaded it back into the pipeline thing. So both the same sort of thing, but again, it's processes that we needed to remember to do if we were changing the pipeline itself. What's special about this process, update pipeline stage, it's got a self-mutate process. So what this does, as part of the CDK solution and CDK pipelines, they've built in a process by which if your pipeline definition, which I included in here, right? If I change any of this, I don't necessarily have to go back and manually update a separate stack myself, right? So once it gets to this stage, it will check the pipeline stack. If there's any changes to the actual pipeline stack, then it will basically start to update the pipeline stack again. It will naturally run an update process on itself. So that's why it's called self-mutate. Once it's updated itself, then it goes back and then restarts the process and cancels the previous one, right? Because it got to this stage, it detected that there was a change in the pipeline, and then it's basically canceled the current deployment process, gone back, self-mutate, so updated its own pipeline. Once it's done that, then it will trigger off another process to go and restore the, I guess, deployment activity from the start again. Okay. So that's one new benefit or feature of CDK pipelines. Then you've got also assets. So there are various instances where you might need a file to be staged on S3 for deployment purposes, and that's where the assets and file asset is being used. For the most part, you probably won't use this. Then we get to the last stage. So this is basically local deployment into our development environment. So just like before, you've got a change set. So this is where in CloudFormation, it's passed in the template, and CloudFormation has accepted that template and has created a change set. In that change set, it works out what it actually needs to do. So if it needs to, say, update an existing resource, or if the update is so significant that it needs to recreate a new resource, then the change set process is there to detect when it might need to create a new resource, apply those changes, and then delete the old resource. Okay. Then we get to the deploy stage. So that's when it's enacting all of those activities that it identified in the change set. And then you've got your integration testing stage, which, much like before, remember how we were using Postman to create a set of test cases, and those test cases we're going to run against the API endpoints. In this solution, I've just not used Postman to avoid having to create an image with Postman and everything. So it's just one less stage. But what I've done is just use Python to call the API endpoints with Python. So we can have a look at that. Don't want to save that. Don't want to save that. And let's open. So here I'm using pytest. Let me go back to, so pytest under the tests integration -v's for verbose. Then it will scan this location, so test integration, looks for any Python application with the test prefix, looks in here, then it looks for any function that has the test prefix. So here it's going to, the first test, it will check for 403 response. So what I'm doing is I'm testing against the private URL. So that's the VPC enabled URL, which is internal network facing, saying that can I run a get response, a get action against that endpoint? And then this is just confirming that I get a 403 response back. So this is because I'm just calling the endpoint without any body and without any API keys. Then this is the second test. I expect a 200 response. Now in this one, I'm doing it a little bit different. I'm creating a connection into the secrets manager. Then I'm going to get the secret text attached to this API secret. And then it should return me the API key for this endpoint. And then here I'm constructing the headers, the authorization, telling it what's the value of the field that's holding the API key. And then this is that same field. And then this is the secret string that should have come back from this response. Now, then I should be able to perform a get method, get action against the VPC enabled endpoint. And if I pass in the headers, which has the key, I should expect a 200 to come back. Okay. And so then we have the other use cases. So this is a little bit more extensive, same sort of thing. Here it's actually just reading one of these payloads. So what I'm doing is I'm reading the payload in, which looks like this. Then I'm getting the secret, I'm creating the header, I'm setting up the URI, and then I'm making a post action into the endpoint, and I expected 200. And here I'm also opening up the response test data, which is this one. So I should get back 11,600. And then that is actually compared to the API response text, comparing to the test data that was loaded from my JSON file. So it's just making sure that when I send in this request payload into my API endpoint, the response that I get back looks like this. Okay, so that's all just defined in a very small function. So then I am later just calling that function over here. So test motor case, and here I'm just passing in the location of the test files and the location of the response file. And I'm doing this multiple times for each of the different tests. And so during integration tests, it will run through these things. Okay, so here, change set was created, the resources were deployed, then the integration tests, you can see them at the bottom here, tested 403, 200, and then these different test cases. Then when we go over to CloudFormation, you can refresh, and now I've got my stack deployed. Okay, so you could see that, and then I'll just go back here. I'm just going to approve it. So all it's doing is deploying a copy of the same thing up above. Okay. So it's going through that whole process, creating another change set for another CloudFormation stack. And this CloudFormation stack just has a suffix of copy, and then it will proceed to deploy it also. So when we go back here, you should be able to see another stack getting deployed. See copy, and this is just sitting alongside the original local deployment. Okay, so now going back a bit, so going back a bit to list all the stacks in our solution, we've got the repository CDK evaluation stack. Then we've got pipelines for the master branch and then for the development branch. Then, as I said, what are these four things down here? Now, if you look closely, this one is for the development branch. So remember, I was saying that I'm deploying a local copy, and then I'm also deploying a duplicate copy of the application also into this environment. And then here, you can also see the master versions. So the original copy and the duplicate copy. So I guess the point here is that even though these application stacks are not defined in the app.py file, right? You've only got three defined here. You've got the repository, pipeline stack, and pipeline stack for dev. But what this thing has been doing is it actually goes into the pipeline stack, and then it can actually see that when you go in, then you go into, say, for example, this second stage, dev descent copy, that corresponds to this bit. So it's saying that under the pipeline master branch, it can see that you've deployed a copy of the wrapper, the web server stage, and then also it can see when you go into the web server stage, it's deployed a copy of master CDK evaluation, which is just defined here. Master and CDK evaluation is just the repository name. And so what this means is you can actually directly access this. So you can directly reference this address, and this knows that it corresponds to this solution. Actually, I deleted the copy. Okay, yes. So I deleted the duplicate copy, and so that's why it's deleting this version up here. And so also, if you wanted to deploy it, you can also do the reverse. You can directly deploy the CloudFormation stack just referencing this path. So that means you don't actually need to go via the whole code pipeline process if you don't want. And if you've got some changes that you want to quickly test and you want to avoid having to go via this whole lengthy deployment process where it goes through build and then it goes updates, self-mutates, might do some unit testing, and then eventually it gets to the deployment stage 5 minutes later, you can bypass all of that by running this command. And then that will go through the whole process of deploying your end solution stack directly from the command line. So that's one other benefit. Okay, that was about it that I wanted to cover in this session. All right, thanks for your time.